The first thing Lieutenant Walter "Red" Davis noticed when he climbed into his brand-new Grumman F-6F Hellcat aboard USS Essex in late 1943 was the weight of the machine. Not physical weight, though the Hellcat had plenty of that, but the weight of purpose. This aircraft existed for one single reason: to take back the Pacific from the Zero. Every rivet, every brace, every inch of its thick wings carried the memories of Pearl Harbor, Wake, the Marshalls, and the long, bitter months of fighting where the A-6M had reigned uncontested in the sky. The Zero had written the rules of the early war. The Hellcat had come to burn them. But there was something the Japanese pilots still believed, something that for 2 years had worked flawlessly. If a Zero got onto an American fighter's tail, the enemy usually died within seconds. The Zero's light frame, huge ailerons, and low wing loading gave it unmatched low-speed maneuverability. It could cut inside turns, climb sharply, and snap into position with movements so fluid they bordered on impossible. The Americans knew this. The Japanese knew this. The ocean knew it too, because it had swallowed every plane that tried to dogfight a Zero in its own arena. But what the Japanese didn't know, not yet, was that the Hellcat wasn't built to dance like their fighters. It was built to break the dance. As Davis sat inside the cockpit, the morning sun turning the Pacific into a sheet of molten gold, he reviewed the doctrine drilled into every naval aviator since the Hellcat entered service. It came from official U.S. Navy fighter tactics memoranda issued after the painful early lessons of 1942. If a Zero gets on your tail, the instructors warned, do not turn with him. Use a high-speed roll and dive. Escape by converting altitude into speed. They had shown gun camera footage from the Solomon Islands, Wildcats trying to outturn Zeros, their arcs tightening, their energy bleeding away, tracer rounds ripping into their wings. You do not fight a Zero in a circle, the instructors repeated. You use gravity, you use speed, you use the Hellcat's strength. And so a new tactic emerged, a brutal high-angle snap roll followed by an immediate high-speed brake turn and dive, violent, aggressive, executed at speeds where the Zero's controls stiffened and its light frame shuddered. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't pretty, but it worked. That morning, as Essex turned into the wind, Davis's squadron, VF-9, prepared for a combat air patrol near the Gilbert Islands, Tarawa specifically, where the Marines had fought through hell only days before. Japanese airfields in the Marshall still sent out raiders, probing the invasion force, looking for gaps. The sky over the Pacific was quiet at first, too quiet. Then the radar warning crackled, bogies inbound from the northwest, altitude 9,000. Davis tightened his harness. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R-2800 roared as he pushed throttle forward, the aircraft surging with a force he still wasn't fully used to. The Hellcat wasn't like the Wildcat he trained on. This thing climbed faster, rolled harder, dove like a meteor. Every control surface responded cleanly even at high speed, something the Zero, with its ultralight construction, simply couldn't match. Yet the danger remained. If a Zero got behind him, even for a moment, the fight could be over. The two formations met west of Tarawa, tiny blue specks and rising silver dots converging in the morning light. The Japanese came in a loose V formation, A6M2 and A6M3 Zeros from the Marshalls, experienced pilots, many veterans of earlier campaigns. They knew exactly what happened when American fighters panicked and tried to turn. The first merge was fast and lethal. VF-9's Hellcats punched through the Japanese formation with hit-and-run discipline, firing in short bursts. A Zero spiraled down, trailing smoke, another dove away to regroup. But then it happened. Davis overshot a diving Zero just by a fraction, and in the space of a heartbeat, another enemy fighter slid onto his tail. The radio barked, "Red, you've got one behind you, brake!" Davis didn't need the warning. The canopy filled with the gleaming white face of the Zero climbing into perfect firing position. The distance was closing, 400 yards, 300, 250. At 200 yards, the Zero pilot's thumb hovered over the firing button, expecting the American to panic in turn. That was what always happened. That was what had worked since 1941. Instead, Davis did something the Japanese pilot did not expect. He slammed the stick hard to the left, so hard it felt like the Hellcat might rip its own wings off, and kicked full opposite rudder, forcing the aircraft into a vicious, high-angle snap roll. The world became a spinning disk of sky and sea. The Zero tried to follow, but at this speed its aileron stiffened, its roll rate collapsed, and its frame began to buffet. By the time Davis came out of the roll, he was already diving, nose down at nearly 400 miles per hour, pulling into a high-speed brake turn that would have torn a lighter aircraft apart. The Hellcat held, the Zero couldn't. It overshot, skidded wide, lost angle, and that was all the Hellcat needed. Davis leveled, yanked back into the fight, and came up beneath the Japanese fighter. A 2-second burst, the Zero erupted in flame and fell like a burning leaf. It was over in less than 10 seconds, but those 10 seconds changed everything. Because now, for the first time, Japanese pilots were discovering the truth. The Hellcat didn't just outgun the Zero, it rewrote the geometry of survival.
The news of what happened west of Tarawa traveled faster than any radio transmission. Pilots talked, crews talked, officers talked. By the time VF-9 returned to the Essex, the deck crews already knew the story. A Zero had lost a tail chase against a Hellcat, not because of luck, not because of a mistake, but because the American fighter had used speed, gravity, and brute force rolling authority to survive a situation that would have killed any Wildcat pilot a year earlier. And although no one said it out loud, everyone felt the same thing. Something fundamental had shifted in the Pacific. That shift became visible weeks later, in early 1944, when the U.S. Navy launched operations against the Marshall Islands, Kwajalein and Roy Namur specifically. The Japanese still had experienced pilots stationed throughout the Central Pacific, many from units that had survived the Solomons. These were men raised in the doctrine of the A60's superiority. They believed, with good reason, that if a Zero could slip behind an enemy fighter on the merge, the kill was assured. But now, Hellcat squadrons were entering combat trained for a new kind of escape. The high-angle snap roll, followed by a high-speed brake dive, executed only at speeds that the Zero could not safely follow. The Zero still held the low-speed turning advantage, no one in the Navy denied that, but the Americans no longer fought where that advantage mattered. Still, the Japanese did not yet understand why their familiar pursuit lines were failing, why Hellcats were slipping away at the exact moment a kill seemed certain. That clarity would come on a pale blue morning north of Kwajalein, when the sun was still low enough that the shadows of airplanes stretched like spears across the ocean below. Lieutenant Junior Leg Lawson of VF-10, flying from USS Enterprise, remembered the moment the bogies appeared on radar. "Bandits, 30 miles, Angels 12, the controller announced. Lawson tightened his oxygen mask. He knew the pattern. Scout Zeros first, then strike aircraft. D3A Vals or B5N Kates if the Japanese believed they had found an opening. The Enterprise launched her fighters, each Hellcat surging skyward on the raw strength of the R-2800. As Lawson leveled at 14,000 feet, the horizon glittered with movement. Zeros, probably from the 752nd Kokutai, approached in two elements, widespread, textbook formation. Both sides saw each other at almost the same moment. Lawson's division merged first. His wingman, Ensign McClure, fired a burst that clipped a Zero's wing and sent it spiraling down, trailing smoke. But in the turn, another Zero slipped onto McClure's tail. It happened fast, too fast for radio warnings. 1 second, McClure was climbing through his firing pass. The next, he had a Japanese fighter locked behind him in perfect pursuit geometry. Slightly above, slightly inside, closing fast. Lawson saw the angle. He knew that if McClure tried to outturn the Zero, he would bleed energy and die. The Hellcat could not win a low-speed radius fight. But McClure did not turn. He did the unthinkable. At nearly 260 knots, he slammed the stick into a high-force roll, kicked opposite rudder, and threw the Hellcat into the same savage snap maneuver that Davis had used near Tarawa. The Japanese pilot, confident that the American would attempt a conventional brake, reacted a half-second too late, and that half-second changed everything. McClure's Hellcat snapped over, nose dropping violently. The Zero tried to follow, but the Japanese fighter was too close, too slow, and too committed to its pursuit line. As McClure dove, the Zero overshot, momentarily projecting forward into open sky, exactly the mistake no Zero pilot could afford. Lawson seized the window. He rolled inverted, dove behind the trailing Zero, and fired a 2-second burst. The 20mm shell struck the Japanese fighter's wing root. The Zero tumbled out of the sky, trailing flame. The remaining Japanese pilots, seeing the escape maneuver repeated a second time, reacted with surprise and confusion. These were veterans of the Eastern Solomons, of Guadalcanal, of Santa Cruz. They had spent years tearing through American formations that insisted on turning fights they could never win. But now the Hellcats refused to play the old game. They were cutting energy downwards, dropping into high-speed dives that the Zero simply could not follow. The battle turned into a series of vertical spirals, each one favoring the heavier, stronger, faster-rolling American fighter. After 10 minutes, the sky belonged entirely to the Hellcats. Later that day, aboard the Enterprise, pilots gathered in the ready room, their flight suits damp with sweat and salt spray. The blackboard at the front listed the kills, 11 confirmed, 3 probable. American losses, 0. But what mattered wasn't the numbers. It was the pattern. The same maneuver had saved 2 pilots against certain death. The same maneuver had forced experienced Zero pilots to break pursuit or lose control authority at high speed. The same maneuver had rewritten the assumptions of aerial combat over the Pacific. From an omniscient distance, one the pilots themselves did not yet possess, the truth was becoming clear. The Zero had reached the limit of its design philosophy. Built for turning, it could not survive in a world that now fought with energy, speed, and structural strength. The Hellcat, meanwhile, was still revealing what it could do, and the Japanese were beginning to understand that the enemy they faced now was not the frail, desperate American fighter of 1942. It was something else entirely, something heavier, smarter, and increasingly lethal. The day the Zero lost its certainty was the day the Pacific War began to tilt for good.
The Zero had always been more than just an airplane. For the Japanese Navy, it was myth wrapped in aluminum, an elegant weapon forged in the era when agility was everything and weight was the enemy. In 1940 and 1941, it carved its legend across the Pacific: China, the Philippines, Wake, Rabaul. Allied pilots whispered about its impossible turn radius, its sudden climbs, the way it seemed to bend the sky itself. But by mid-1944, during the lead-up to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Zero's myth was beginning to crack. The reason wasn't only the Hellcat's firepower or engine or armor. It was the maneuver the Japanese had never trained to counter. Because before the Hellcat, no American aircraft could survive it. A Zero on your tail had been death. Now it was a problem with a solution. June 19, 1944. The Marianas, the morning that would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Dawn painted the Pacific pink and gold as Task Force 58 waited for the attack everyone knew was coming. Japanese carriers, Shikaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, Junyo, and Hayo, were launching wave after wave of fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes. It was the largest carrier duel yet fought in the Pacific, and it was the first where the Hellcat would meet the Zero on a massive scale. Lieutenant Jim Harris of VF-16 stood on the deck of the USS Lexington, watching the first wave of Hellcats roar off the flight deck, R-2800 engines thundering like artillery. Harris wasn't a rookie. He had flown the Solomons in a Wildcat, had seen men die trying to escape Zero pursuit by turning when they should have dove. Now in his Hellcat, he carried the new doctrine like a shield. Roll and dive, don't turn, his instructor had told him. High angle snap, make him overshoot. Force him into the vertical, fight him where he's weak. At 10 a.m., TF-58's radar screens lit up like constellations. Large raid inbound, bearing 315, distance 150 miles. The Japanese were coming. Harris's division intercepted the first wave at 20,000 feet, Zeros escorting D-4Y Judy dive bombers. The two formations closed fast. Harris fired first, sending a Judy spiraling down in flames. But in that moment of success came the danger. A Zero dropped behind him, sliding perfectly into the same lethal position generations of American pilots had feared. "Two on your tail, Harris," his wingman shouted. Harris didn't answer. He couldn't. The Zero was already closing, the pilot confident, certain that the American fighter would try the old trick, an instinctive hard turn that would bleed speed and tighten the Japanese pilot's jaws for the kill. But Harris didn't turn. He rolled. A brutal, wrist-snapping full-stick overroll that slammed his shoulder into the cockpit wall. The Hellcat flipped with a violence no Zero could match. At 280 knots, the F-6X's aileron still responded sharply, its frame solid, its control surfaces tight. The Zero tried to follow, but at this speed, its roll rate collapsed. Its wings, designed for delicacy at low speed, fought the air. Harris felt the aircraft yaw, then snap into a dive. He didn't level out. Instead, he pulled into a descending brake turn so steep that his vision blurred at the edges. The Hellcat screamed downward, nearly 400 knots now, its R-2800 roaring like a living thing. The Zero followed, too late, too fast, too committed. Its wings buffeted violently. Aileron stiffened. The pilot tried to hold the line, but physics wouldn't allow it. The Zero overshot, flashing helplessly into the forward arc, drifting into the open sky. Harris saw his chance. He rolled upright, pulled behind the Zero and fired a 2-second burst. The Japanese fighter burst in the flame, spiraling down toward the endless Pacific. That was one kill, but the moment that mattered came minutes later. The second Zero to drop behind Harris was more cautious. This pilot had seen the snap roll trick once already. He expected a dive. He anticipated a roll. He held back, trying to catch the Hellcat in a delayed pursuit. This time, Harris didn't roll immediately. He pulled up. The Hellcat climbed sharply, another thing Japanese pilots weren't used to seeing at high speed. The Zero followed, but its climb rate suffered at these speeds. Harris waited until the Zero was just close enough, then rolled inverted and dove vertically. It was the perfect rope-a-dope. The Zero pilot tried to match the move, but the aircraft simply wasn't built for high-speed vertical transitions. The controls resisted. The airframe groaned. The dive steepened beyond what the pilot intended. He lost the line, lost the angle, lost the kill. Seconds later, a Hellcat from VF-20 swooped in and finished him. That encounter, written later in the squadron report, carried a single, underlined conclusion. Zeros unable to maintain pursuit above 280 knots, repeated overshoots caused by snap-rolled evasions. Throughout the day, the same pattern repeated all across the sky. Near the USS Bunker Hill, Ensign Robert Mirsky used a snap roll at 10,000 feet to break a tailing Zero, then reversed into a steep dive that caused his attacker to stall out. South of the task force, VF-15 pilots executed roll and dive escapes that left Japanese fighters scattered and disorganized. Again and again, the Zero lost its edge not in turning fights, but in high-speed maneuvers that exploited its structural limits. By noon, the myth of the Zero, its aura of inevitability, had cracked. Not because the aircraft was suddenly inadequate. It was still deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. But now the Americans weren't fighting the Zero of 1942. They were fighting with altitude, with energy, with speed, with knowledge. And nothing broke a legend faster than knowledge. By the end of June 19th, U.S. aviators had downed more than 300 Japanese aircraft, most of them Zeros, while losing fewer than 30 fighters. The maneuver the Japanese had never expected became the pivot on which air superiority tilted forever.
The Zero's legend should have ended in the Marianas, but legends die slowly, and the skies over the Philippines in late 1944 still carried the old ghosts of its reputation. After all, the aircraft was not the problem. Its pilots were. The Japanese Navy was running out of veterans. The elite men who had flown over Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Java, Midway, and the Solomons were mostly gone, replaced by young aviators with barely 100 flight hours. Many trained in rushed wartime programs with limited fuel, limited instructors, and almost no gunnery practice. Yet they inherited the same doctrine. If you can get behind an enemy fighter, the kill is yours. That belief met its final reckoning during the battles around Leyte Gulf. October 1944, Task Force 38 roamed the Philippine Sea like a storm of steel. Dozens of Hellcat squadrons rotated through combat air patrols above the fleet. VF-14, VF-19, VF-20, VF-22, VF-27, and more. The sky shook daily with battles as Japanese land bases on Luzon and Formosa hurled everything they had left. In one of those engagements, just north of Mindoro, Lieutenant Sam Keane of VF-20 experienced firsthand how the combination of tactics and physics had rendered the Zero obsolete even before the Japanese fully understood why. Keane and his wingman spotted 6 Zeros approaching from the east at roughly 14,000 feet, their noses glinting metallic white in the sharp tropical sun. The American pair climbed to meet them, hoping to attack from above, but the Japanese pilots were alert and swung immediately into a climbing turn to force the merge. The moment the two formations crossed, a young Japanese pilot slid onto Keane's tail. Keane recognized the sight instantly, the Zero's wings tilting, the nose lifting slightly above his tail line, the faint shimmer of sunlight reflecting off the clear canopy. The Japanese pilot was good. Calm, steady. He had closed the distance perfectly, settling into the exact pursuit angle that had killed hundreds of American aircraft earlier in the war. But he had never fought a Hellcat. Keane kept the throttle high. He resisted the instinct, the deadly instinct to turn. Instead, he pushed the stick hard right and kicked full left rudder, executing a snap roll so savage it crammed his body against the harness and hammered the blood from his head. The Hellcat rolled twice, once cleanly, once violently, then immediately pitched downward into a high-speed dive. The Zero tried to follow, but the Japanese pilot made two mistakes. First, he rolled too late. Second, he rolled too gently. At speeds climbing past 260 knots, the Zero's controls stiffened, its roll authority collapsing into sluggish, unresponsive motions. It entered the dive off-axis, cross-controlled, unable to match Keane's descending brake turn. In the space of 3 seconds, the Zero overshot so dramatically that it shot forward like a stone skipping out of its proper trajectory. Keane felt the airframe shudder as he pulled into a left wing down, tightening spiral. The Hellcat handled the stress. The Zero did not. Keane shoved the throttle forward, pulled level, and reversed upward. The Zero flashed into view, too fast, too shallow, too late. Keane fired a 1-second burst. The Japanese fighter split apart in midair, shedding fragments that glittered like silver ash. Moments later, another Zero locked onto the tail of Keane's wingman. Keane saw the angle, saw the danger, and saw the opportunity. The Zero pilot was committed, his wings dipping slightly as he pressed inside the pursuit curve. Keane dove, rolled, and came up beneath them, watching the geometry unfold like a diagram. The Zero was closing, 200 yards, 180, 150, but the Hellcat ahead did not tighten into a turn. It dropped, a sudden, high-speed nose-down roll that hurled the aircraft into a diving spiral. The Zero followed, and once again physics betrayed it. Lightweight, lightly built, optimized for slow-speed agility, the Zero simply could not hold control authority in the high-speed vertical. It wobbled, its nose dipped unintentionally, the pilot overcorrected, the aircraft skidded wide. In that instant, the pursuit collapsed like a broken bridge. Keane fired. A bright arc of tracers swept across the sky. The Zero exploded into a rolling ball of flame. The fight ended in less than a minute, but the pattern had become unmistakable. On that day alone, VF-20, VF-14, and VF-27 all reported the same thing in separate, unrelated engagements. Enemy fighters overshoot repeatedly when target executes high-speed roll and dive. Some Japanese pilots tried to adapt, attempting to hold back during pursuit, to anticipate the dive and strike from a distance instead of closing fully. But they were trapped by doctrine, taught to close, to press, to finish at short range. And they were trapped by physics, because even if they anticipated the maneuver, their aircraft could not match it. The Zero could not safely dive at extreme speeds. Its wings, lacking self-sealing tanks and combat plating, flexed and buffeted under the loads the Hellcat shrugged off. Its ailerons hardened, its elevator response weakened. It lost the ability to fight in the vertical. The air war over the Philippines marked the moment when Japanese pilots began to understand, fully and painfully, that the Zero had been born into a world of turning duels, but the war had evolved into a world of energy fighting. And in that world, the Hellcat was king. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea, as Kane flew back toward the carrier decks lined with yellow-shirted handlers, he realized the strange, sobering truth. The Zero had not grown weaker. The Americans had simply learned to fight smarter, and smarter was now enough to win.
By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had become a grinding, relentless machine, and nowhere was its steel chorus louder than over Okinawa. Carrier Bix groaned under the weight of endless sorties. Radar screens glowed through sleepless nights, and every morning began the same way, with the rising hum of the R-2800 as Hellcats clawed into the sky to meet whatever the Japanese threw next. And what they threw, now more than ever, were Zeros. Not the proud elite Zero wings of 1942, but patched-together units flying a mix of aging A6M5s and late production airframes rushed out of increasingly desperate factories. Many pilots were barely trained. Some had fewer than 50 hours of flight time. Others were veterans assigned to lead formations that simply could not keep up. Yet they carried the same doctrine and the same belief. If you can get onto an enemy fighter's tail, the kill is certain. This time, however, certainty was a luxury no Japanese pilot could afford. April 1945. Task Force 58 floated off the coast of Okinawa, a still archipelago of carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Hancock, and Intrepid, launching continuous air patrols to stop kamikaze raids from Kyushu. The air was thick with tension, with exhaustion, with the unspoken knowledge that the war was nearing its final brutal act. That morning, VF-12 launched from the Essex. Among them was Lieutenant Paul Mercer, a pilot who had survived the Solomons and the Marianas and had learned, like every seasoned Hellcat driver, one truth: the Zero was only deadly if you let it fight its fight. Through the misty haze rising from Okinawa's burning shoreline, Mercer's patrol spotted them, 9 Zeros descending from the north, flying loose, uneven, but fast. Their mission was clear: break through the CAP and strike at the fleet. Mercer's division turned into them. The sky flashed with gunfire. A Zero disintegrated under a burst from Mercer's wingman. Another dove straight at the ships below, chased by 2 Hellcats. But then Mercer made the mistake every fighter pilot fears. He committed to a firing pass too long and overshot his target by mere inches. In that tiny sliver of time, a Zero slid onto his tail, perfectly positioned, perfectly aligned, a killing geometry older than the war itself. Mercer didn't panic. He didn't turn. He didn't flare into a defensive spiral. He shoved the stick hard right, slammed full left rudder, and threw the Hellcat into a violent, high-angle snap roll that bent the horizon into a spinning, chaotic smear. The Zero followed, confident, fast, hungry. But the moment Mercer's Hellcat entered the dive, the laws of physics declared their verdict. At 260 knots, the Zero's ailerons stiffened. At 280, its wings buffeted. At 300, the fighter became a knife in a hurricane, unable to match the heavier, far stronger American machine. The Hellcat tightened the brake turn. The Zero couldn't. It overshot, just as dozens had done before, sliding helplessly into Mercer's forward arc. Mercer didn't even need a full burst. 3 shells struck the ring root and the Zero folded downward like paper. But the moment that defined the battle came seconds later. A second Zero, this one flown by an older pilot, clearly experienced, approached from above, executing a perfect high-angle dive.
This one didn't fall for the obvious trap. He held his distance. He anticipated the roll. He avoided the overshoot. He descended with discipline and patience that spoke of real combat experience. And for a heartbeat, Mercer felt the ghost of 1942, when the Zero ruled the sky, when American pilots fought with fear stitched into their bones. The Japanese pilot closed slowly, carefully, refusing to commit fully. Mercer knew that the snap roll defense couldn't work the same way unless the Zero tried to follow, so he changed the geometry. He leveled, climbed. Not a gentle climb, but a high-powered, high-speed ascent that forced the Zero into the vertical, where the Zero's outdated design simply could not live. The Japanese pilot tried to follow. His angle was good. His entry was smooth. But at high speed, climbing sharply, the Zero lost everything that made it fearsome: its agility, its responsiveness, its grace. The Hellcat still had full authority, the Zero almost none. Mercer watched the nose of the Japanese fighter wobble as its elevator stiffened. He felt the instant the enemy lost control authority, a heartbeat of hesitation, a micro-stall in the climb. Mercer inverted, rolled and dove. The Zero plunged forward into the empty sky beneath him, unable to correct, unable to follow, unable to fight. The rolls reversed in less than 3 seconds. Mercer fired. A flash of orange erupted across the Zero's fuselage. It spun downward, trailing fire into the clouds. That single engagement broke something far greater than an enemy fighter. It broke the last illusion of the Zero's invincibility. In squadron ready rooms across the fleet, pilots wrote the same words in their combat reports. Enemy aircraft unable to pursue high-speed roll and dive. Zero stalls in vertical at high speed. Overshoot predictable when Hellcat maintains energy advantage. What had begun west of Tarawa, what had repeated over Kwajalein, what had become undeniable in the Marianas, now reached its final irreversible truth at Okinawa. The Zero was no longer the hunter. It was the hunted. And a high-angle snap roll, the maneuver Japanese pilots never expected, had quietly become one of the most decisive tactical shifts of the Pacific Air War. By the time the sun set over Okinawa that day, Mercer sat in the ready room staring at the chalkboard listing the kills. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something quieter, deeper, a realization that the war's final chapter was already written in the sky above him.